Of these many oppositions, obviously the one that I'm going to talk about is implicit in the title, Creation and Discovery. And this is nicely brought out by Edward Glover in his 1950 criticism of Jung. I think it was a book called Freud or Jung. And Andrew Samuels refers to this in Jung and the Post-Jungians. And he says that Glover wanted to know whether the self was to be conceived of as something one works towards or makes, or as something one is developing out of or from. So is it there from the start and one develops out of it, or is it something one works towards as a goal and makes in the course of life? And this ambiguity is also apparent in Jung's description of individuation as a process in which I become the person that I already am. Now, what I'm aiming to do in this paper is to show that the opposition between the self as something we discover, finding the person I really am, and as something we create, a process of becoming, is more apparent than real. That it's not a contradiction or a paradox, but a conjunctio. There is no making without finding, and there is no finding without making. More precisely, we can find ourselves only through creative activity, but we can only be creative on the basis of that which is there to be found. Now, one way of going about this is to think about who is doing the creating, because in Jung's model of the self, and I think this is unique to Jung, there are two centres of activity and intentionality, the ego and the self. So the self for Jungians is almost always more than myself, more than the person I take myself to be. And this contrast is well brought out by the classical Jungian analyst Edinger, who very much emphasises the found or discovered aspect of the self, to which he unequivocally attributes the role of creation. I hope you'll be able to see that in this quote. He says, "The whole of the psyche is an objective entity, and that whole is not made by the ego, but is only discovered by it. We do not create ourselves. We are created. That means that what we discover in the individual psyche is what has been created, not what we have made." Now, Edinger, I think, is referring to the experience, or perhaps I should say the discovery of the self, often referred to by Jung as an experience that happens to us, rather than one we make. This strand in Jung is summed up by the phrase that he uses, that the self in relation to the ego is the mover to the moved. So he talks about the self standing behind the ego as a more compendious personality which takes the ego into its service. And in a particularly dramatic image, Jung speaks of how the conscious personality is pushed around like a figure on a chessboard by an invisible player. It's this player who decides the game of fate, says Jung, not the conscious mind and its plans. Jung also attributes to the self a strong, irresistible urge towards its own realisation. He conceives the self as the motor force of individuation, the source of an urge which he says has got an inability to do otherwise. I think this way of thinking about the self can suggest that the life of an individual is somehow determined in advance, and that individuation consists in somehow living out the self as it ought to be, which is another phrase that Jung uses. And that makes the self some kind of blueprint, rather like the DNA instructions that tell the acorn how to become an oak tree. Now, there's another kind of sort of branching of the oak tree here in terms of whether that is a kind of a general set of instructions which tell us, as it were, how to be a person, but not necessarily a specific set of instructions which tell us how to be the particular person we are. But that's one of the things that I'm leaving aside. But I think that Jung can be read that way, but you don't actually have to read very much Jung to see that Jung is actually very well aware of this, and that he's all the time balancing this. He obviously became aware of the deterministic implications of this viewpoint, and he sought to correct it by emphasising the active role of the ego in bringing the self into being. And it does seem that that this element became more and more apparent in his later work. In the passage where he states, "It's not I who create myself, rather I happen to myself," and this was written I think about 1940, it's from the Transformation Symbolism in the Mass. He goes on to say, "But fundamental as it is, this can only be half the psychological truth, for otherwise it would be tantamount to determinism. An absolutely preformed consciousness and a totally dependent ego would be a pointless farce, since everything would proceed just as well, or even better, unconsciously." And I think this is Jung being quite scientific here and thinking, really what is the purpose, in a sense, very much akin to the way people would now say, and maybe he did have it in mind, what is the evolutionary purpose of consciousness? What is consciousness for? Which I think is the kind of questions that people are asking now, who are studying the science of consciousness. Now, in this sense, individuation isn't something that happens of its own accord, just this sort of ineluctable urge that happens whether we like it or not, according to our conscious will or not. But it's a special state of self-reflective consciousness that, according to Jung, develops in the second half of life and is brought about by conscious deliberation and requires great effort, in fact. And this is what he calls the work against nature, the opus contra naturam. Now, I think despite Jung's strong caveat about determinism and the role of consciousness, many modern, or perhaps I should say postmodern Jungians, are uncomfortable with the idea of the self as an agent in its own right, over and above the ego. And this is because the intellectual currents associated with postmodernism and social constructionism are sharply critical of any theory which assumes a pre-given foundation or essence of being, which shapes our life and makes us what we are. Postmodern theories are constructionist in that they argue that the reality of the world, and therefore the self, is constructed between us. In other words, in terms of this antinomy I'm setting up, they're models of creation rather than models of discovery. In this view, there is no ultimate foundation of existence that constitutes reality, either inside us or in the external world. So the self and the world are constructed, not found. I think this view has been most systematically developed amongst Jungian thinkers by New York Jungian Polly Young Eisendrath, who rejects any notion of a pre-given essential self and insists that, I quote here, "all experience is constructed in a context that includes culture, language, and other persons." She specifically objects to the notion of a self that implies intentionality and design, the idea that the self wants to do this, or the self is saying this, and that there is a kind of a pre-given purpose. So I think she would rule out of court this notion of the mover to the moved, and the chess player who kind of pushes the ego around. And instead she emphasises the self as what she calls an organising principle of transcendent coherence. I'll say that again, it's actually a very compact phrase. An organising principle of transcendent coherence. She emphasises the role of the self in creating a sense of coherence. So, while the process of individuation might help us to experience ourselves as organised by a centre that we can't directly perceive, it's impossible to claim, as some Jungians do, that the self has specific intentions and designs of its own, and far less that we can know what these are. In this view, the archetypal self creates the possibility of personal coherence, rather than any particular form of coherence. Now, a similar view from a sort of different perspective was taken by Louis Zinkin in this society, who goes so far as to disclaim interest in whether or not an objective self exists at all. "The sense of self," he writes, "has always seemed to me to be of more interest than discussion as to whether there is an objective self which exists or not at any particular age." This is something which James Astor, who's a leading exponent of Michael Fordham's work, took exception to, because, as he said, this point of view, this is quoting James Astor, separates Zinkin from his Jungian origins, since by excluding the self from being a given, which can lead to archetypal activity, which can integrate experience, and give rise to experiences which transcend the ego, one of the unique features of Jung's psychology is lost. Well, I think there's something in this, that stance that sort of, that James Astor is standing up for, of a self that's kind of beyond the ego and is objective. But I do think that Louis Zinkin is a more subtle thinker than James Astor gives him credit for, because Zinkin's interest was in what makes it possible to speak about the self in the first place. That is, what are the conditions which create a sense of self without which any talk of the self is not possible. Now, he explored these issues in one of his last papers, which he called with typical precision and wit, "Yourself, did you make it or did you find it?" I found it because he got there first, otherwise that's probably what mine would be called. Now, his title also echoes Winnicott's description of the transitional object as a paradox which must be accepted without resolution. As Winnicott says, we may not ask the infant, "Did you find it or did you make it?" Now, this idea of a paradox, whether applied to the transitional object or the self, won't do for Zinkin, who he felt that paradox should be no part of scientific inquiry. He argues, following Rom Hare, that the primary reality is social. Therefore, the self must be made through social interaction. There can't be anything there before. Initially, through the particular language used between mother and baby. And this is Zinkin again. The self comes into existence only through interaction with others, and the form it takes, the sense the individual has of being or having a self, will depend greatly on the culture in which he or she has been brought up. It is created, made and formed, not by any single act, but by a continuing interaction with others. So, taking an intersubjective view, Zinkin emphasizes his conviction that one becomes real through recognition by others. I think he'd agree with Astor's assessment of his position in that he states, the self, whether discovered or created, is not a given. It is always a construction. But I find it curious that in this statement he leaves room for the possibility of discovering the self. So apparently it is possible to find the self even though it's always a construction. This seems to me like paradox coming in again around the back door. Now, I go along with Zinkin a long way, but there is one point where I kind of stumbled against his argument, and that is where he takes Winnicott at his word, as it were, and tries to resolve a paradox that's not really a paradox. In other words, I think that Winnicott has, in saying that this finding it or making it is a paradox, in a way has created a problem that doesn't really need to be there. So Zinkin, wanting to find a way through this paradox, insists that the baby's experience of finding the transitional object is an illusion. Really, we can see that he's created it. So he says, well, it might be important to the baby to maintain the illusion that he's found the transitional object, but really we can see that it's something which is created. Now, I think this is an argument about seems and is. Applied to the self, it would suggest that it would only seem as if we're created by the self, the way that Edinger says. Really, we've created it. Now, I believe that both are true, and that we should retain Jung's model in which ego and self construct one another. Unlike Polly Young-Eisendrath, she gave a talk here a few years ago, and she said, I'm a constructivist all the way around the block, which fascinated me because I didn't quite know what a constructivist was at that time. But I think I've come to the conclusion that I'm a constructivist halfway round the block. Round the other side, the self is constructing me. Now I want to go into this business about transitional objects in a bit more detail, and I think that will sort of help to see what I mean about this finding and making going together. In the earliest interaction between the mother and the baby, as Winnicott says, creates the breast, but he can only do so if the breast is there to be found at just the right moment. Now here indeed the baby seems to create the breast, which is in fact found. The infant's creation of the breast is an omnipotent illusion, dependent on the participation of the mother, which the infant is not fully aware of. But this is not the case with the transitional object. Here what's happening is that the infant takes over the maternal function of providing meaning through his own use of a piece of material reality, whether it's the sort of the blanket or the teddy bear or a gesture or a little sort of tune or a bit of babble. It's something which the infant has got from outside. It's a piece of material reality, some part of the found world, which he now transforms through his own creative activity and gives it meaning. Now my point is that there can be no transitional object without this found element. Otherwise, creativity remains stuck at the stage of omnipotent illusions. And in fact, a great deal of narcissistic pathology, particularly where grandiosity is a feature, is of this kind. And I'll come back to this in the clinical material which follows. Now, all this is very much akin to Michelangelo's portrayal, in which he talked about the sculptor finding in the stone the image that is already there, as if the job of the sculptor is not so much to create the image as to find it, to reveal it. Now, I imagine that Louis Zinkin would say that the sculptor only seems to find the image, really he creates it, and in a sense that's sort of common sense. But just as the infant transforms a piece of reality, the artist works on the stone to make of it more than it is. But the image is made out of the stone, out of a reality which is already there. At the same time, what he makes out of the stone depends on something which already exists within himself, something though which can't be revealed except through his making of it in the external world. The piece of reality he finds enables him to bring forth something out of himself in the act of making it in the world. Thus, creativity is a relationship, a bringing together of that which is there to be found internally and externally, and in so doing, transforming both. Actually, it just occurs to me that this rather reminds me of Jung's transcendent function. The image is not already present in the artist's mind, except as a potential image, an airy nothing, as Shakespeare calls it. Nor is it there in the stone, but the stone shapes the artist and his work as much as the artist shapes the stone. And this, I think, is why Winnicott says the question is forbidden. Not, I think, because it's a paradox, but because it's unanswerable. It's the sound of one hand clapping. The transitional object only exists in the intermediate area between the two hands of finding and making. Now, if this is also true of the self, we might begin to see why it's not possible to state what the nature of the self is. The self is made out of something found, and therefore does have an essential reality. But it's impossible to say anything about what that reality might be, since it's only sayable within language. That is, within a consciousness constructed in a context of culture, language and persons, as Polly Young-Eisendrath says. Anything that we know has already been subject to construction, and it's not possible to separate out the elements out of which it's been made. Once the artist has done his work, how is it possible to separate the image in the stone from the stone in the image? In a sense, the stone is the image and the image is the stone. We can no more say what was there before it was made than we can say anything about the universe before the Big Bang. When talking about the universe, before is also a forbidden question, because it doesn't have any meaning. Of that which is unknown, we can say nothing. Or as Wittgenstein said, the truth can be shown, but it cannot be said. I suggest that the found world constitutes and can be experienced as a limit to our creative possibilities. And it's exactly this limit which narcissistic grandiosity attempts to remove, to abrogate. Because while the self is constructed, it is not and cannot be constructed out of nothing. You can't just create any self, and there's an important difference here between making and making it up. Without some conception of a found world and a found self as limiting factors, there's no basis on which to build on a sense of authenticity and truth. We're then in a world in which a thing is true because I say it is, sort of Humpty Dumpty in Alice in Wonderland, or because you say it is, or even because we say it is. There's nothing beyond that. Now, I think that given that the self is always a construction, we need to add in questions about what it's constructed out of and by whom. Because I think the problem then is, with the constructivist view, apart from, the well-known problem of relativism, the issue that I'm particularly concerned with here is authenticity. That it seems to me then very difficult to have a basis on which to distinguish between a true self and a false self. Because if I can make myself, or if I'm constructed by what happens to be, then, where is there any truth in it? Now, the clinical material I'm going to talk about, from a patient I'll call Nathan, illustrates all this, because these were exactly the issues that were of central importance to this man, and he worked on them with great perseverance and tenacity and urgency throughout the course of a 5-year analysis. This man had a sort of rather well-developed false self-system, which was generated by what he called his superstructure. Now, but his false self wasn't really quite like the kind described by Winnicott, that's based on compliance with the mother's gesture. The compliant false self-personality eschews its own potential for creativity and submits to the mother's intentions. In the interaction between what's found and what's made, the created world of the infant is subsumed in the found world of the mother. The infant becomes the mother's creation. Now, Nathan had taken the opposite path, that is, the wholesale repudiation of the found world and an attempt to replace it with his own self-created version of it. He'd resolved the paradox in favour of creation, but at the expense of discovery. He believed that he could be anything he wanted to be, and if he wasn't, it was due to his own failure, for which he persecuted himself unmercifully. He'd become a made-up person, literally a self-made man. Now, he was one of these people who's a very talented narcissist. In other words, somebody who has the kind of internal resources and talents to give a lot of apparent actuality to his grandiose illusions. He had a very forceful personality, great intellectual ability, and a real gift for metaphorical language. One of the first things he said to me was, "Beware of me when I am silver-tongued," which he later described as the first opening of the vaults. He'd been developing his artifice self from the age of 8, when he had to go and visit his aunt, who'd just had a baby, and he said to his parents, "What should I say?" And they said, "Well, I don't know, say, what sort of question is that?" Anyway, Nathan was terribly worried about this, so he went away and he wrote a speech, which he then learned by heart. And when they arrived at the hospital, he then gave this speech, word for word. And you could still see this. I mean, he had what I rather sort of liked it, but he did have a certain sort of formality of language that it was apparent in the way he spoke. Now, from these origins had developed this vast edifice of the superstructure, which was rather like one of these self-care systems that Donald Calshed describes, which both protected him, intervening between him and the rest of the world. On one occasion he said he went to this sort of horrible party where he felt humiliated as a teenager, and he said the superstructure said, "Come away with me and I'll make you great. Do what I say." But of course it also persecuted him, because if he didn't live up to what he was supposed to do, then woe betide him. So instead of genuine dependent relationships with others, what he had was a driven need for glory and triumphalism. In this situation, the development of personality becomes a kind of arbitrary self-assembly. Another patient, who doesn't have the kind of resources that Nathan has, described a very similar process. This man said to me that, he said, until I was about 14, I didn't have a personality. People would ask me what music I liked, what football team I supported, and I wouldn't know. I didn't have any opinions because I didn't have any experiences. So I set out to make a personality. but it's like a scaffolding without foundations. At the slightest criticism, it could all collapse. And he talked about how he'd sort of take a bit from here and a bit from there, and he'd sort of go out and buy records and sort of listen to them so that he'd have something to talk about, this sort of thing. But the obvious artificiality and futility of this process shows clearly that whatever a constructed self might be, it can hardly be this kind of deliberate, conscious attempt to construct a personality. No matter how great the superstructure, there's always a fundamental split between me and my personality. The self-created self has to be continually kept in being to prevent its collapse. Such people, and I'm thinking of other people again, talk about having a front which they can present to the world, but it's like a front without a back, like a one-dimensional film set. Deprived of the kind of interactional environment that allows for both finding and making, the ego has to use its own resources in an attempt to keep itself in being, but is then continually on the edge of collapse. Such people lack the experience emphasised by Edinger of feeling themselves to be created by a power greater than their own consciousness. Like Frankenstein, they attempt to mimic the power of the self to create an ego, in their attempts to use their own ego to create a self. In fact, they succeed merely in creating a monstrous persona that never quite hangs together and has no life of its own. Many of these issues came together in a session from about the second year of Nathan's analysis, and I'd like to describe this session to you. One thing I need to say about Nathan is that most of his life has been dominated by his relationship to a very powerful narcissistic father, from whose glamorous thrall he'd struggled to release himself most of his life. In this session he told me a dream about a man called Charlie who worked for his father as his father's driver. He's a pathetic man, Nathan said. My father abuses and curses him, humiliates him and degrades him, treats him like a circus clown. In the dream, Nathan is very rude to Charlie, and Charlie hits him. Nathan is very upset, as much because he's been rude to Charlie as because Charlie's hit him. He said that somehow Charlie was much stronger and assertive in the dream than he was in real life. Here Nathan provided his own interpretation. It was a very disturbing dream, he said, but it now occurs to me that Charlie is me, and that in the dream I'm my father. I've been wimpish with my father and allowed him to treat me badly. Then he went on to say that he'd been looking in a shop window on the way to the session, and he'd seen something he particularly liked. But then he started wondering about this, and he thought, why are the things that I like important? Because surely everyone has things they like, and it's only things that everybody likes are important. Why are the things that I like of any particular importance? And then it occurred to him that, of course, the reason they're important is because they're important to him. And he said this seemed to solve a riddle. I said that his insight solved the riddle of himself. Like Charlie, he had allowed himself to be mistreated because he felt he had no worth. He treated himself with the contempt with which Charlie treated his father, but now the servant part was fighting back. In the statement, I like X, whatever it happens to be, I said, the important thing isn't X, the thing that you value, but the I who values it. The discovery of yourself as important and valuable. There was a silence for a few moments, and then Nathan said, I'm immensely grateful to you for saying that. And then there was a longer silence. Then he talked about feeling that he was always living on a stage, he was always looking for value outside, and only what was important on the external stage could have any value for him. There was another even longer silence, a very deep, reflective silence. And then he said, when I come here, I've often got a sense of trying to get at something, as if I'm searching for something. I've now got a sense of being a unity, of being a united whole. I realise that my conscious self is only a part of what I am. It's an important part, but not the whole. What I've been doing is trying to project my conscious self on the stage, as if I was like an actor who could play any part. But all the time I've had an instinctive self that's been going about its business behind the scenes. This is the self that instinctively likes particular things. And then he said, look, this isn't fanciful, but he says it's like with Hitler, and he was very interested in Hitler and the great dictators. Hitler usurped power that he didn't have a right to. It was illegitimate power. He claimed to represent the German people, but he didn't. He only represented a part. That was irresponsible. Whereas Churchill was a legitimate leader who represented the whole people, a whole nation. He paused and asked if what he was saying made sense to me. I'd little to add, but I felt I needed to share something of my own thoughts to let him know how I'd been actually very affected by what he said. And I said it reminded me of Macbeth, the theme of being a player on a stage, but also the theme of usurping power. And he was very enthusiastic about this because we'd already established that we shared a love of Shakespeare. He said, yes, he says, this is a consistent theme in Shakespeare. The usurpation of illegitimate power leads to the disruption of the natural order. Only legitimate power leads to natural rule, the rule of nature. Now, I saw this metaphor of usurpation as a vivid image of what Jung calls ego inflation and what Fordham calls ego omnipotence, the assumption by the ego of the powers of the whole self. I think my interpretation that he had intrinsic value over and above what it was that he liked offered him a sense of recognition and worth that reunited what he made with what he found. He was continually trying to remake the world in his own image, since he was unable to find his own image in it. In the session we spoke only about the thing that was desired and the I that desires, but I think there's another element which is crucial, and that's the element of personal choice. The fact that he likes certain things rather than others. Through the things in the shop window, Nathan was able to find a sense of his own uniqueness. He found who he was through what he liked. In themselves, the things of the found world don't signify anything. The act of liking is a creative relation to the found world, which confers meaning on both the thing that's liked and the I that likes it. The objective existence of things out there to be liked, things that he finds and hasn't made, is essential to this process. In other words, what I'm suggesting is the things that he was looking at in the shop window were transitional objects. They certainly weren't made by Nathan, and they certainly weren't made up, but nor were they merely found. What was found, in fact, was himself. And what then seemed to emerge naturally in the course of the session was a sense of that more compendious personality as Jung describes it. The ego, I think, is like a midwife to the self. It provides the means through which the self may be brought into being. The self becomes real through incarnation within a particular ego. Margaret Clark has made this point very well. I'd like to quote something she says. I got this idea about incarnation from her, although I suppose she must have got it from Jung. But as I say, I think she puts it very well. She can tell us later. She says, the coming of unconscious contents, the self, into consciousness is symbolised in Christianity by the story of the incarnation of God. As our self comes more into consciousness, we become more conscious of reality, of the inevitability of limitation, failure, separation, conflict, and loss. But without this limitation, there can be no incarnation at all. The only channel for a realisation of any part of myself is the consciousness and actions of my ego and my body, which have to exist and act in particular time and particular space. Equally, I can live out only one of the many lives potentially in myself. If I choose to be an analyst, I can't also be an accountant. Assuming one wishes to be an accountant, but obviously some people do. In fact, my father was an accountant. He liked it very much. I'm sure he wouldn't have liked being an analyst. The model of individuation is the incarnation of the self within the particularity of the ego is once again a fusion of creation and discovery. It's constructionist in that it suggests we construct our lives out of the choices we make. And this would include, I think, the narratives we construct to make sense of those choices. But it's foundationalist or essentialist in its assumption of inherent potentials which also shape us, which are somehow pre-existent and which are realised through the process of making those choices. This involves realisation in two senses. Firstly, the sense of realising something in the sense of making it real in the world, and secondly, in the sense of coming to know something. Oh, I realise this, that and the other. Now I think Jung thought about individuation mainly in the second sense, that is, a process of self-reflection that leads to an increased awareness. That's a realisation of the self. And because of this, Jung relegates the events and choices of the first half of life to the realm of the persona, which he regarded as essentially collective and not individual. Learning how to live in the world, work, relationships, way of life, where you're going to live, who you're going to live with, all these are regarded as somehow prior to and separate from individuation, which according to Jung begins when these choices have all been made, and as he puts it in the second half of life, when the wine begins to clear. Then of course we see what it is we've become, but it does seem strange to me to suggest that the choice of what we become is not also a crucial part of self-realisation. In my view, an adequate persona, which is constructed, is vital to the task of realising the self, which in many respects isn't. The persona acts as the channel through which the inherent potential may be realised. And while there may be many potential selves, I don't think these potentials are unlimited. If they were, we'd be back to Nathan's fantasy in which I could be anything. In fact, this fantasy is only tenable until we begin to act, and then we discover what's possible for us and what's not. So this suggests that a great deal of individuation concerns not the self at all, but the ego. It's the ego which individuates, and in so doing permits the particular realisation of the self. The existence of inherent potentials also functions as an important limit to omnipotent grandiose fantasy. Nathan eventually came to feel a sense of reassurance in the idea that what he was depended on what he called the random shuffling of the gene pool, and was not dependent on his own capacity to create something, anything, out of nothing. The experience of limitation involves loss and disappointment, but can also be the guarantor of reality and truth. Nathan told me that when he was 18, he was offered a place at university to read mathematics and philosophy, which I think it was at Oxford, which doesn't surprise me. As I said, he was obviously very intellectually able. His father was literally a self-made man, a fully paid-up member of the University of Life Brigade, and said, "Oh, what do you want to go and do that for? You know, a lot of nonsense, you know." And because he was so much in the sort of thrall of his father, as I said, he didn't feel he had enough self, I suppose you might say, to challenge his father, and he caved in, and he went to work for his father in his father's business. And he ended up in a field of business that could never utilise his very considerable intellectual and literary talents. And of course, this was, a source of terrible regret. This was a man in his 40s, that he'd never done this, never been to university, and he'd had to become, a self-taught man. And he was, remarkably, well-read and scholarly, and considering he'd not had much formal education. Now, it was because of this, was one of the things that fueled his I Could Be Anything fantasies. And he came to a session one day and said he had an important insight about this. He'd been reading a book on the philosophy of mathematics and finding it rather hard going. And it suddenly occurred to him, what if I'd taken that place at university and I hadn't been able to cope with it? I'd have come up against other people who were more brilliant than I was, and this would have snapped me out of the frame of mind in which I could do anything, be anything. A politician, a mountaineer, a mathematician, a historian, a businessman. Imagine me having to go to a tutor and say, "Look, I can't cope with this." It would have been good for me. It would have given me a realistic view of my limitations. Or would I have just rubbished the course and gone off to do something else in the same way? Now I pointed out, and he could readily see, that this was an analogy for the therapy university, in which he was coming up against his limitations with me. I was the tutor to whom he was coming and saying, "Look, I can't cope with this." But he could also see, and I think at this point more clearly than I could, that the only life he could live was in fact the one he had lived. Might have been is just another version of I Could Be Anything. He could also see that the picture of his real self had to include that aspect of himself which denied it, the possibility of going off and rubbishing the course in favour of fantasy. That had to be part of the picture, because it was part of the picture. The experience of limitation can also alert us to the presence of that larger, more compendious personality that seems to operate behind the scenes. The ego can have a sense of going in the wrong direction, and that may lead to a sense of finding oneself that's only perhaps possible if one has somehow lost oneself along the way. And this is the sort of thing that brings people into therapy. In fact, therapy Nathan had got very depressed when he realised, he wasn't going to be live a life full of the fame and glamour and wealth that he'd imagined, and he went into a depression, and that's what brought him to therapy. Now, I had a similar experience, which set me on the path to becoming an analyst rather than an accountant. Actually, I gave that up when I was about 13. Although my father still says that I could have been an accountant. You'd have been a good accountant, you see. But I didn't like that particular ex. But in fact, what I wanted to be was a rock guitarist. And I did, I played well, and this was a realistic ambition. I played well enough for it to be realistic. But despite this, at all the crucial moments, I took the decisions which took me to university, where I developed the intellectual interests and so forth that would later serve me well in my career as a psychotherapist. I read Hamlet, I developed an interest in the self, and so on and so forth. But I was still set on being a rock guitarist, and after university I played in a number of groups rather unsuccessfully, and had another number of temporary jobs just to sort of keep body and soul together while this was going on. And one of these temporary jobs was my first social work job. About 10 days before I was due to start this job, I realised this wasn't a temporary job, that I wasn't really going to be a musician, and that this was the beginning of what I was really going to do. And after about 10 years of dreaming about being an aspiring guitarist, this was not a pleasant realisation. I wanted desperately to argue with it, but I knew it was absolutely fruitless. It's very hard to describe the feeling that I had in a moment like this, but it was as if I was being commanded to follow a path, and I had no choice in the matter. It was as if something was saying to me, you will go that way. At various times since, I've thought about this experience as a sort of road to Damascus affair, almost as if the hand of God was pointing out the way, you will go this way. And it certainly gave me a sense of vocation that's always been with me. I've never, ever doubted that I was on the right path ever since that moment. But if I think hard about it, I can see that what this moment really was a realisation. It was a realisation of something which I'd been refusing to recognise. Looking back, it's obvious that I wasn't, as they say, cut out to be a musician. And I wouldn't know about the aspects of myself which made that so. I wasn't going to progress any further as a musician, and I could no longer avoid facing this truth. This wasn't, I think, then exactly an experience of the self. So, I don't think I need to argue with Polly Young Eisendrath on this one, that it was, as it were, the designer speaking directly to me. But it was an intimation of the existence of the self through the realisation of another part of me that knew about me, as it were, much better than I did. In one sense, the coming into consciousness of unconscious factors like this, and the gradual expansion of consciousness that this produces, is not unlike Freud's formula, that where it was, there shall I become. But unlike Freud's view of the id, Jung's view of the unconscious self includes intelligence, purpose and meaning, often far in advance of anything known by the conscious mind. The desires that come from beyond the ego may be instinctive, but they're not necessarily instinctual. As consciousness develops, the ego becomes more aware of its dependence on forces beyond its own knowledge and control. This isn't exactly news. It's well known that the more you know there is to know. At the same time, the sense of being on the right path, following the right direction, being in harmony with Tao, fosters a progressive accommodation of the self to the ego, and the development of a persona which has the freedom and flexibility to express internal needs. I didn't go into the social work and counselling and psychotherapy world ready-made. Having found my way, I had to spend a long time making my way in the world. This also means that only what's expressed in action has real substance, and vice versa, that the reality of action has unavoidable implications for the process of individuation. In a sense, you are what you do. This was something Nathan said to me, and it took me a while to get at what he meant, because I always had the idea that you are what you are, and what you do may or may not express what you do. But this is quite subtle, actually. Well, this is somewhere where I think there are a lot of contradictions, but I'd just like to pursue this idea, because I think it's a very interesting one. And give a couple of examples that he gave. Because you see, the thing is, what he was on about was that there isn't some kind of ethereal self that you can be in potential and say, well, that's who I really am, and this self that I'm living isn't really me. I've got somebody who is like this. This is a woman who was told, by her parents that she had a wonderful talent as a writer. And she has always believed that she's a writer. Now, she's now in her early 30s. She's not written anything to speak of. And she does something quite different. But she still believes, I am a writer. And in fact, as a result of this split between... She says, her life is not me. My life is not me. And of course, the result of this is her life is a complete disaster, because she doesn't put any kind of anything of herself into it. And therefore things are continually happening to her, and she feels like a victim. Interestingly, Nathan also went through a period of trying to write during the course of the therapy. And he described how he had to see off persistent interference from his attempts to be a writer. He would get into the role of being a writer, and then this would break his concentration, break the flow, and the writing wouldn't happen. It was only when he could forget about that and just write, because of course a writer is someone who writes. And he gave another example of that, where this began to sort of shift, where he said he was staying in a hotel overnight, and there was a fire, and everybody had to be evacuated. And he realised afterwards that he had just reacted in the way that he'd reacted, whereas previously he would have been busy, paralysed by the notion that he had to play the role of man in hotel fire. I wouldn't have known what to do. And I said this rather reminded me of Sartre's idea of bad faith, when he talks about, some of you may come across this, he describes the waiter who's playing the part of being a waiter. So it's sort of very mannered performance. And he loved this, you see, and he took up this idea, and he used to talk about serving the soup, getting on with serving the soup, as his metaphor for being himself. Now, the thing about this is that it means that there is here a very clear distinction between the self and the sense of self. Because any sense I have of myself, whether it's writer, analyst, accountant, whatever, is necessarily partial. There isn't any way I can comprehend everything that I am. And this is a point made repeatedly by Michael Forden in his examination of Jung's two views of the self as the totality of the psyche and the centre of the psyche. So when I say that I am what I do, I don't mean that I can be defined by any particular action. What I am is the sum of all my actions in the world, and neither I nor anyone else is in a position to make any final judgment about me, even after my death. The idea of a definitive biography is more wishful hope than factual reality. The self cannot be encompassed by any knowledge of it. Nathan struggled with this issue with great intensity through the last 2 years of his analysis. In the search for what he called the truth of myself, he was desperate to find some kind of objective criteria, some fundamental bedrock that would protect him from illusion and artifice. My greatest fear, he said, is that what goes on between you and I is an illusion. He felt strongly that in his search for truth, faith was not an acceptable option. And that included faith in psychoanalysis and in me. One day he was coming to a session and he realised that the song he was humming was that one by The Who, Won't Get Fooled Again. He was continually confronted by the challenge of scepticism. What if? In one session he explored the core of this conundrum. What if we're duped, he said. How is it possible to believe in anything? How do I know what meanness is? What does it fundamentally mean? It's the same with matter. When you get down to quarks, they don't really exist. You see, I had faith once. I had faith in my father. That faith has been shattered, found to be a delusion. Therefore faith is not available to me again. I have to have a consistent worldview that is not based on faith. He put a great deal into hammering out a consistent worldview that wasn't based on dogma, orthodoxies or external authorities of any kind, and I put up with months of him sort of attacking religion and spirituality as tosh and drivel, and it's often quite difficult to hold my counsel. The crucial thing, scientific rationalism became very important to him, along the lines of sort of Dennett and Dawkins and people like that. And the crucial thing about this for him was that it was something that was external to himself, something that gave him some foothold of truth in a reality not of his own making. And as he sort of worked away at this, sort of, backwards and forwards, eventually I came to feel that the essential thing was the process of working at it. And he was greatly relieved when I pointed out that the total consistency he was looking for led exactly to the kind of fixed delusion that he was always trying to guard against. The guarantor of truth, I said, is not the product, but the process. And he did come to find a sense of inner security through the process of creating a worldview. Now, the final point I want to make, and this is my conclusion, is that the creative process is the self in action. The self is not, and never can be, a thing or an object. The self is a process which is continually creating itself. It's creation itself, which is the pre-given self. Something which can never be defined, because it's always changing, always in the process of becoming. The absolute foundation, the essence of being, is creation itself. The self is the creative capacity to make pattern and meaning. Insofar as we can discover the self, what we discover is that capacity. The danger is when we take this or that pattern that we discover to be the pattern maker itself. Mandalas, for example, are merely aids to meditation. They point the way to an experience which for Jung was the ultimate, but they cannot really represent that experience. Nevertheless, I believe it's important to hold on to the self, that the pattern is something we discover as well as something we create. So we need to maintain a proper reverence for the creative capacity of a self beyond the ego. And this is the self in which it is making us. And as we go through life, we find what the self is making of us, and it's not always to our liking. Nathan sought to find the absolute. Perhaps we might imagine him like an alchemist searching for the philosopher's stone. But the source of creation is not anything, not even a thing in itself. That would imply that there's something outside what we create, a world of eternal forms, separate from the world of temporal images. However, as I've been suggesting, these two worlds come into being together as the conjunctio between finding and making, and cannot be separated from each other. The creator is to be found only in creation. There is no eternal form, no thing in itself, no absolute, that's somehow outside the process of being and becoming. And that's exactly what troubled Nathan so much when he said, when you get down to it, quarks don't exist. There is no bedrock, but there is a process. Nathan came to put his faith in the process because he experienced it. He lived it out through the analysis and thereby made it real. What he found was his own creative capacity, and he learned to put his trust in that, not in the glamorous surface of what it produced. "I've smuggled in a lot of truth with the beautiful confections I fed you," he said to me. But the truth wasn't in the confections, but in the process of making them. Similarly, the worldview he came to believe in was not ultimately the content of it, but the process of arriving at it. Self-experience doesn't have a place, and it isn't a thing. This doesn't make it unreal or arbitrary, but it does mean that it cannot be an object of consciousness. As soon as I think about my experience of myself, it becomes the thing I am thinking about, and my experience has shifted to the experience of thinking about it. So in the end, Nathan put it this way: I have faith in what I know, but I haven't got there by faith. I would add that, like Jung, he got there by experience and was then able to say, I don't believe, I know.